The Haunted Closet. The summer of 2013 arrived like a specter suffocating the city in unbearable heat, and it was in the shadows of twilight that I sought refuge. At that time, I had nothing but time to lose myself in trivial dealings and thoughts. It was on an insignificant afternoon that a friend, eager for an exchange, offered me an old Ouija board in trade for a video game I had long abandoned. The aged wood of the board had an air of a cursed relic, but what captivated me was the promise of easy profit it might bring. Initially, the board seemed like a fraud. I laughed to myself, knowing the object was destined to gather dust in some forgotten corner. So I threw the board on the living room floor and went on with my life with the nonchalance of someone who doesn't believe in legends or superstitions. But the next morning, I found the potted plants adorning the coffee table toppled over, with dirt scattered across the carpet as if some invisible force had pushed them. And there, amidst the debris, lay the Ouija board. I didn't recall placing it there, and the wind certainly wasn't to blame, as all the windows were closed. A dark unease took root in my chest, but I forced myself to believe I had merely been careless. I took the board to my room, tossing it disdainfully onto the floor beside the bed, and once again tried to forget its presence. That night, the usual silence of my room was broken by a muffled click, a fragile sound that echoed like a gunshot in my mind. My eyes opened slowly, and through the thin slits of the closet door, I noticed the light inside was on. My eyebrows furrowed in perplexity, as I never used that light, nor did I remember turning it on. Trembling with a fear I still refused to acknowledge, I got up and opened the closet door. As I expected, there was nothing inside but a void that seemed to envelop me. I turned off the light and returned to bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. However, sleep refused to embrace me, and I found myself in a state of anxious wakefulness, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. 10 minutes passed, and then the click came again. This time, my heart nearly stopped. The closet, which I had left in darkness, now gleamed with the light I swore I had turned off. Panic began to consume me. I rose slowly, each step laden with a primal terror. I opened the closet door, and once again there was nothing but my own clothes hanging, swaying slightly, as if touched by invisible hands. I turned off the light, now with a sense of nausea rising in my throat, and shut the door with force. I returned to bed, but found no comfort among the sheets. Time seemed to stretch into a shadowy eternity. My eyes burned, refusing to close, waiting for the inevitable. And then, without warning, the entire room was suddenly filled with light as I heard the main light switch flick. I had seen enough and was out the door within seconds. I quickly pieced things together and threw that old Ouija board into the nearest dumpster. Nothing strange ever happened after that. Since that night, I was never disturbed again. The house returned to being just a construction of wood and bricks, without whispers in the shadows or treacherous lights. However, something inside me changed. Perhaps it was the shattering of my arrogance, or perhaps it was the recognition that there are forces we should not attempt to understand, forces that rest, waiting only for an excuse to manifest. And I, for a brief moment, gave them that excuse. The Death Omen. The weekend was perfect for relaxing and forgetting about the daily grind. My friend, always curious and playful, found a Ouija board in a pile of trash while we were walking around the neighborhood. It was a piece worn down by time, yet it still held an air of mystery that intrigued us. We decided to take it home and see if we could get some fun out of it. That night, we gathered a small group of friends in the living room. The dim light from the lamps and the silence of the late hour created the ideal atmosphere for what we were about to do. We placed the board on the table and began to play, not giving much importance to what we were doing. We were skeptics, after all, and believed that any movement of the planchette would just be a prank among us. As the questions began, we laughed at the absurd answers that came up. But when someone asked about death, everyone fell silent. The atmosphere, once light, became heavy. It was then that I decided to ask the board, "When will I die?" The planchette began to move slowly, tracing letters that formed the word tomorrow. I looked at my friend, convinced he was just playing a prank, but he assured me, with a serious and trembling look, that it wasn't him. The next morning, I woke up with that word still echoing in my mind. But I chose to ignore the omen and go about my day as usual. By late afternoon, I took my dog for a walk on a nearby trail. The sun was beginning to set, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. We were almost at the end of the walk when the unexpected happened. My dog's leash snapped, and he bolted toward the road. I shouted his name and ran after him, my heart racing. That's when I heard the terrifying sound of an approaching car. The driver, panicked, honked as he tried to swerve. I jumped to the side, barely avoiding being hit. The car passed, grazing my foot, but I was unharmed. My dog, miraculously, also escaped without a scratch. Still in shock, I returned home. That evening, as I was having dinner in the kitchen, a sense of unease washed over me. I sat at the table, right under the ceiling fan, which was spinning at full speed. It was at that moment that something unimaginable happened. I got up to get a glass of water from the fridge, and a loud crash echoed through the kitchen. I turned just in time to see the fan plummet from the ceiling, destroying everything in its path and leaving shards of glass scattered across the floor. Terror gripped me. If I hadn't stood up at that exact moment, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. 2 near-fatal incidents in one day after the Ouija board's premonition was a coincidence I could no longer ignore. Since then, I swore never to touch a Ouija board again. What started as an innocent game almost ended in tragedy. And although I don't easily believe in curses or supernatural forces, I can't deny that on that day I faced something beyond my understanding. The Porcelain Doll. It all began innocently enough, as many terrifying stories often do. My cousin, a fearless young man, had always been fascinated by the occult, and his latest obsession was an old Ouija board he had acquired. On a rainy night, he, his brother, their father, and a friend decided to test the board in the basement of their house. The setting, with its damp walls and dim lighting, seemed perfect for what they were about to do. Before starting the session, they removed a porcelain doll from the basement. The doll, with its glassy eyes that seemed to follow every movement, had always unsettled them. They decided to place it in the adjacent room, lying face down on a pile of towels. With that, they believed any discomfort would be contained within that room, far from the influence of the board. The session began trivially, with silly questions that seemed to just echo in the void. However, at some point, curiosity led them to ask the board who was in the other room. The planchette began to move, but instead of forming words, it started spelling out a sequence of numbers that made no sense. Without understanding the meaning, they continued with the questions until my cousin, who had stepped out to go to the bathroom, returned. When he came back, he saw the numerical sequence the board had spelled out and immediately recognized it. It was his social security number. The blood drained from his face. He knew no one there knew that number. The atmosphere, once merely gloomy, transformed into something more sinister. They then decided to challenge the entity that seemed to be responding, asking it to prove its presence. The board, with chilling coldness, spelled out the word die. Immediately, everyone felt a malevolent presence take over the room. Trembling, they decided to check on the porcelain doll they had left in the adjacent room. When they opened the door, their terror became real. The doll, which had been lying down, was now standing upright, positioned directly in front of the door, staring at them. Those glass eyes that once seemed harmless now emanated an aura of pure evil. The fear was overwhelming. They screamed and ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. Later, still in shock, my cousin's friend decided that the only way to rid themselves of the curse was to burn the Ouija board. But the trauma of the experience ran deep. He spent months disturbed, his sanity shaken, as if something from that night had taken hold of a part of his soul. Despite the warning, my cousin made a strange decision. He enlisted in the Air Force, perhaps hoping to escape the fate the board had predicted for him. Today, he is stationed at a base in Europe, but not a day goes by that he doesn't remember that terrible night. And in his darkest moments, he wonders if he will ever be able to escape the curse that the Ouija board cast upon him. The presence in the house. The house was silent, enveloped in the darkness of a stormy night. I had always been curious, always drawn to things I couldn't explain. So when I found myself alone at home that weekend, I decided I would finally try using the old Ouija board I had found in the attic. It was one of those ancient ones, with worn edges and wood darkened by time. Something about it seemed both inviting and repellent, as if it harbored secrets that shouldn't be revealed. My parents were away, and my brother was on a Boy Scout camping trip. The idea of spending the weekend alone, with the storm raging outside, seemed ideal for such an experience. At midnight, with the lights dimmed and the sound of rain hitting the windows, I placed the board on the dining room table and began the session. At first, nothing happened. I asked several questions, but the planchette remained still, cold under my fingers. After a few frustrating attempts, I gave up and put the board back in its box. I decided to go to bed, but sleep was elusive. Something about that night just felt wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a creaking noise coming from the front door. My first thought was that the wind was forcing the old wood of the house to make noises, but the sound repeated itself, closer this time, as if something was moving through the house. My heart began to beat faster. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The creaking continued, now coming from the stairs. Someone or something was climbing the steps, and the heavy, methodical sound filled me with a terror I had never felt before. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sound was unmistakable. Step by step, the thing was getting closer to my room. I sat there, motionless, holding my breath, hoping it was just a nightmare. But reality was crueler. When the sound stopped outside my door, I felt panic consume me. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the darkness became almost tangible. I knew something was there, waiting, but I didn't know what. Then, a lightning flash briefly illuminated my room, and what I saw terrified me to the core. A black shadow, tall and formless, seemed to writhe in the corner of the room, its limbs long and thin like dry branches, reaching towards the door. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of rain and distant thunder. Suddenly, the bedroom door slammed shut with a loud bang, as if pushed by an invisible force. The shock snapped me out of my trance, and I threw myself under the covers, trembling uncontrollably. I lay there, in a state of pure terror, waiting for the worst. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on like an eternity. Finally, the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. I gathered the courage to leave my bed and inspect the house. Every step I took felt like it could be my last, but to my surprise, everything was in place. There were no signs of a break-in, nothing out of place. But when I returned to the dining room, my blood ran cold. The Ouija board, which I had put away, was back on the table, the planchette resting gently on it. Without hesitation, I grabbed the board and threw it in the trash can outside, making sure it was taken away by the garbage truck that same morning. Since then, the house has never been the same for me. Every shadow seems to hide a presence. Every sound at night brings back the memories of that horrible shadow. And though nothing else has happened, I know that something was awakened that night, something that should have been left alone. The mysterious mark. For as long as I can remember, we've always had one of those old Parker Brothers Ouija boards sitting in our closet, collecting dust. As a child, I always wondered what it was. From the box, it seemed like a horrible board game. Then one day, I found out what a Ouija board really was, and I immediately dug it out of the closet. I insisted on my brother trying it out with me, and eventually, he agreed. We placed our hands on the planchette, and I began asking the typical cliché questions like, "Is there anybody there?" and "Can you answer me?" At first, there was no response, other than my brother jokingly moving the planchette around to imitate an answer from some kind of entity. But after a while, we got bored and put the game back in the box. That night, I did a little research to find out how to make Ouija boards work. Many people online said that the most ideal environment when using a Ouija board is in a dark room lit only by candles. So when my parents weren't home, I managed to gather 6 or 7 candles and convinced my brother to try it one more time. I lit the candles and set them around the dining room table with all the lights off. We tried one more time. I asked again if there was anybody there. This time, the planchette began to move. I told my brother to stop moving it, but he swore he wasn't doing anything. I told him to move his hand away, and he did. The planchette kept moving on its own. My brother thought I was messing with him, but I ignored him and kept watching. The planchette landed on the word yes. I was only 9 years old, so I was terrified. My older brother took over and asked the next question. Are you a good spirit? There was a 5-second pause before my brother's hand, along with the planchette, moved to the word no. We both looked at each other, and at that point, I ran to my room and slammed the door shut. But my brother continued with the so-called game. I heard his muffled voice coming from the dining room when suddenly I heard him scream at the top of his lungs. I ran back downstairs to see what was wrong. He was holding his shirt up, revealing a small open wound that almost looked like a claw mark. He told me to light the fireplace immediately, and I obeyed. He threw the Ouija board into the fireplace and told me never to speak of what happened to anyone. We have never used a Ouija board since.